When you get to my age, people stop asking about the pain. They stop asking about the nights your arm felt like it had nothing left in it after 9 innings, or the mornings when you could barely button your shirt because your shoulder was so stiff. They ask about greatness instead, about the men you remember after all these years, and maybe that is how it should be. I spent most of my life standing 60 feet and 6 inches away from some of the greatest baseball players who ever lived. I watched men walk into the batter's box carrying entire cities with them. Brooklyn, San Francisco, New York, Pittsburgh. You could feel the stadium shift when certain names were announced. The crowd got louder, then quieter. Pitchers slowed down without even realizing it. Catchers started thinking a little harder about the next sign. That is what people misunderstand about baseball. Greatness is not numbers alone. It is not batting titles or home runs or newspaper headlines. Greatness is presence. It is a feeling that one man can change an entire game with a single swing. Some players carried that feeling every time they stepped onto the field. I faced Hall of Famers. I faced champions. I faced men who could hit a baseball farther than most people thought possible. But only a few ever made me truly stop and think differently on the mound. Only a few made baseball feel larger than the game itself. At 90 years old, those are the men I still remember most clearly. Not because they scared me, because they earned my respect. And there were 5 players I could never forget. When people ask me who the greatest all-around player I ever saw was, I usually think about Willie Mays before anybody else. A lot of men could hit, a lot of men could run, some could field, a few had power. Willie did everything, and somehow he made it all look natural. That was a part that stayed with you. Nothing ever looked forced with him. He played baseball the way some men breathe. The first thing you noticed was the energy around him. You could feel it before the game even started. Dodgers and Giants games already carried enough tension on their own, especially in those years when every inning felt like it mattered for the pennant race. But when Willie walked onto the field, the ballpark changed a little. Fans watched him differently. Players watched him differently too, even if they would never admit it publicly. Pitching to Willie Mays was exhausting mentally because there was no safe moment against him. You could throw a good fastball and still watch him line it somewhere. You could get ahead in the count and suddenly he would turn a difficult pitch into something dangerous. A lot of hitters waited for mistakes. Willie could hurt you even when you made a quality pitch. That is what separated him from most players I faced. I remember standing on the mound during tight games against San Francisco and realizing you could never relax once he stepped into the batter's box. Even when you thought you had him set up, he was already adjusting. Great hitters make adjustments during at-bats. Willie seemed to adjust during pitches. That is a rare thing. And then there was the way he played defense. Most stars wanted to be remembered for hitting home runs. Willie wanted to control the entire field. He took pride in every part of the game. You could see it in the way he chased fly balls, the way he moved on the bases, the way he carried himself inning after inning. He played baseball with joy, but also with authority. I remember one night at Dodger Stadium when the crowd went completely silent after he stepped in during a late inning situation. Nobody needed the scoreboard to understand the moment. Everybody in that park felt the same thing. One swing could change the night, maybe even a season. That is greatness to me. Not statistics, not trophies, presence. And Willie Mays had more presence than almost anybody I ever saw. Hank Aaron was different from Willie Mays. Willie brought electricity into a stadium. Hank brought silence, calm silence, the dangerous kind. He never looked like he was trying to impress anybody. He did not need dramatic swings or loud emotions. Everything about him was compact, controlled, efficient, and somehow that made him even more frightening to pitchers. A lot of hitters in those days tried to intimidate you before the first pitch. Some crowded the plate. Some stared at you from the batter's box. Some talked. Hank Aaron almost never did any of that. He just stood there quietly, hands resting easy, on the bat, looking completely comfortable. That confidence could bother a pitcher more than anger ever could. When I faced Hank, I always felt like every pitch mattered a little more than usual. You could not drift mentally for even a second. He was too smart for that. He studied pitchers carefully. He noticed arm angles, timing patterns, little habits most players ignored. And once he picked something up, he remembered it. That was one of the reasons he stayed great for so long. People talk about his home runs, and they should. But what I remember most was how balanced he looked at the plate. Even against good velocity, he stayed under control. Some hitters looked violent when they swung. Hank looked precise. The ball came off his bat differently, too. You could hear it immediately. Pitchers notice sounds like that. We always did. I remember a game against Milwaukee where I got ahead of him early in the count and thought I had him exactly where I wanted him. I tried to get a fastball inside, not a terrible pitch either. Hank turned on it so quickly that all I really remember is hearing the crack and watching the outfielders take a few hopeless steps backward. And that was the moment I understood something about him. He did not need your mistakes to beat you. Sometimes your best pitch still was not enough. What also impressed me was his consistency. Baseball wears people down. The travel, the pressure, the expectations, the injuries nobody talks about publicly. Most players eventually show frustration. Hank rarely did. He carried himself the same way, whether he was in a slump or hitting 300. Younger players noticed that. Veterans respected it. There was dignity in the way he played, quiet dignity. He let the game speak for him. And over time, pitchers learned the same lesson about Hank Aaron. If you lost focus for one pitch, he could make you pay for it immediately. That kind of greatness lasts forever. Mickey Mantle was probably the most naturally gifted player I ever saw. With Willie Mays, you admired the complete game. With Hank Aaron, you admired the precision. With Mantle, you almost admired the danger. Everything about him felt dangerous. The power, the speed, the way the stadium reacted whenever he came to the plate, even before the first pitch. People were already waiting for something dramatic to happen. I did not face Mickey as often as National League hitters, but you did not need years of matchups to understand what kind of player he was. One batting practice session could tell you enough. I remember watching balls leave his bat during all-star gatherings and hearing players laugh in disbelief. Not because it was funny, because sometimes that was the only reaction left. The ball sounded different coming off Mantle's bat. And what made him even harder to understand was that he could do it from both sides of the plate. Switch hitters always create problems for pitchers, but Mantle turned it into a weapon. He could change the entire feel of an at-bat depending on which side he stepped into. Pitchers had to rethink sequences, rethink locations, rethink mistakes against Mickey Mantle. Mistakes usually did not stay inside the ballpark very long. But the thing people forget about him was the speed. Everybody remembers the home runs. They remember the tape measure shots and the stories from Yankee Stadium. What they forget is how fast he was before the injuries started catching up to him. He could beat you in more ways than one, and that made him exhausting to pitch against mentally. Some sluggers become easier once you avoid the middle of the plate. Mantle still found ways to hurt you. I remember one all-star game where he stepped into the batter's box and the entire mood inside the stadium shifted. Fans leaned forward. Infielders took extra steps back. Even pitchers who pretended not to care usually worked a little slower against him. That is something viewers at home probably never noticed, but players did. Baseball players recognize fear faster than anybody. What stayed with me most was the sound. Certain hitters had sounds attached to them forever. Willie Mays had crowd energy. Hank Aaron had sharp precision. Mickey Mantle had violence, clean violence, the kind that made pitchers turn around before they even wanted to. And yet off the field, he often seemed uncomfortable with his own greatness. I think that made fans love him even more. He carried pressure most men could never understand and still walked onto the field every night expected to become the hero. A lot of players were stars in those years. Mickey Mantle felt like an event. Roberto Clemente played baseball with pride in a way that was impossible not to respect. Some players loved the game. Some players loved competing. Clemente carried something deeper than that. Every inning mattered to him. Every throw mattered. Every at-bat mattered. You could see it in the way he ran onto the field, the way he chased balls into the corner, the way he refused to give away even a single play. The first thing most people noticed about Roberto was the arm. Even from the dugout, you could feel how dangerous it was. Runners changed their minds because of him. Coaches stopped waving players home because of him. Outfield assists became expected, which is remarkable when you think about it. Most players make a great throw once in a while. Clemente made great throws, feel routine. But what always impressed me most was the intensity. Roberto played every game like October baseball. Some stars coast through parts of a long season. He never seemed interested in that. Whether it was April or September, day game or night game, he carried the same seriousness onto the field. Pitchers notice players like that because they force everybody else to raise their level too. Our games against Pittsburgh were never easy, especially when Clemente was locked in at the plate. He had incredibly fast hands and he could handle pitches in places where most hitters became vulnerable. You could jam him and still watch him muscle the ball into right field. You could throw outside and suddenly he would drive it somewhere with authority. He did not always look polished in the traditional sense, but he was unbelievably competitive. I remember watching him during close games and realizing how badly he wanted every moment, not for attention, not for statistics, for pride. There is a difference. Some players want applause after a big play. Roberto seemed to want respect more than applause. Ball players understand that difference immediately. And then there was the dignity he carried with him. Baseball in those days was not always easy for players coming from places like Puerto Rico. Roberto carried that weight every day, and he still walked onto the field with tremendous strength. Younger players looked up to him for reasons that went beyond baseball. Veterans respected him because they understood how hard he fought for that respect. When news came about his death years later, it hit baseball very hard. Some players leave behind records. Some leave behind memories. Roberto Clemente left behind something larger than the game itself. Even now, when people speak his name, there is a certain tone in their voice, almost like they are talking about someone unfinished, someone baseball should have had longer. That is how greatness works sometimes. It stays with people long after the final game ends. Frank Robinson brought a different kind of pressure onto a baseball field. Willie Mays brought excitement. Hank Aaron brought precision. Mickey Mantle brought power. Roberto Clemente brought pride. Frank Robinson brought confrontation. The moment he stepped into the batter's box, you felt challenged, not just physically, mentally. He played with controlled anger and pitchers could sense it immediately. Some hitters wanted to outplay you. Frank wanted to dominate you. There is a difference between those two things. He crowded the plate without fear, stared right back at pitchers, and carried himself with an edge that never seemed to disappear. A lot of players talked tough in those days, but Robinson actually carried that toughness into every at-bat. Facing him was exhausting because he never seemed uncomfortable. You could throw inside, and instead of backing him off, sometimes it only made him more dangerous. Pitchers usually survive by creating hesitation in hitters. Frank Robinson rarely hesitated. He trusted his hands, trusted his instincts, and attacked mistakes with unbelievable force. I remember games against Cincinnati where the dugout already felt tense before Robinson even came to the plate. Everybody understood the situation. Outfielders shifted deeper. Infielders became quieter. Catchers slowed the game down to think carefully about pitch selection. Frank had that effect on entire teams. He forced opponents to play differently. One thing I always respected about him was how complete he was as a competitor. He was not simply a slugger waiting for home runs. He understood situations. He understood pressure. Late innings never seemed to speed him up emotionally. Some players become anxious when the game gets tight. Frank seemed to become sharper, and he carried enormous pride as a black player during a difficult period in American sports. That toughness people saw on the field did not come from nowhere. It was built over years of fighting for respect in a game that was not always fair. I think a lot of pitchers understood that, even if nobody openly talked about it at the time. What stayed with me most was the intensity in his eyes. There were hitters who looked relaxed before pitches. Frank looked prepared for combat, not reckless, focused, completely locked into the moment. Pitchers notice eyes. We always notice eyes. I faced many great hitters in my career, but very few combined power, intelligence, competitiveness, and intimidation the way Frank Robinson did. He carried himself like a man who expected to win every confrontation on the field, and most nights he gave himself a real chance to do exactly that. When people ask me about greatness, I do not just think about talent. I think about presence, about force, about the players who changed the emotional temperature of a stadium simply by walking toward home plate. Frank Robinson was one of those players. Baseball looks different to me now. The uniforms are different. The stadiums are louder. The game moves at a different pace than it did when I was young. But greatness itself has never really changed. You still recognize it the same way. You feel it before the first pitch. You see it in the reactions of other players. You hear it in the silence of a crowd waiting for something important to happen. At 90 years old, I probably remember feelings more than statistics now. I remember the pressure of standing on the mound against Willie Mays and knowing the game could change instantly. I remember the quiet confidence of Hank Aaron, the raw power of Mickey Mantle, the fierce pride of Roberto Clemente, and the intensity Frank Robinson carried into every at-bat. Those men made baseball feel larger than a sport sometimes. People spend a lot of time arguing about numbers. Greatest hitter, greatest player, greatest era. That is part of baseball and probably always will be. But players remember something different. We remember moments. We remember tension. We remember the feeling certain men gave you when they stepped into the batter's box and the entire stadium leaned forward at once. I was fortunate to play in an era filled with extraordinary talent. More importantly, I was fortunate enough to stand across from men who pushed the game to a level that inspired everybody around them. They forced pitchers to become smarter, tougher, more disciplined. In many ways, they made me better too. That is what true greatness does. And after all these years, those are still the players I remember most clearly.